James Miller, how you doing?
I am doing well. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a guest on your show today.
I'm beyond excited. I kind of bumped into you through my publicist, Dennis Welch, when I wrote my book, and he said you got to get on this guy's show. You have to reach out to him. So you were gracious enough to have me on your show, and I tell you what, since I've been on your show, so many amazing things has happened. Your outreach, and when I say this number, it's going to shock my listeners, but you have like 3.5 million, million people that follow you on your lifeology journey. And that's awesome. That's awesome.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm so humbled by that. I once was on a guest on someone's show and they're like, James, how does that feel to have that many people listen to you? And I was like, it's such an abstract number because when I'm in studio or I'm at home right now, but if I don't see those people. And so obviously
right.
I could literally see them, it'd be a different story, but it is very humbling. And so I love to I get to meet so many people like you and just hear people's story. And I just kind of get lost in the interview process. And then I'm like, oh yeah, other people are listening to that as well.
Well, before we go any further, I owe you an apology. Oh. I swore twice on your show. Oh. And I had to go back and watch it. And I'm going, I don't remember swearing. And I went back and I found the two words. Now this on my show, you're welcome to occasionally swear. That's fine. Yeah. But I do apologize for that.
No, it's totally fine because you were in the moment, you were feeling it, and I was like, it's fine. It's obviously with my rating, it's a family rating, and so with that, those particular words, I still were able to meet under the G-rated version of it, so it was fine. So it wasn't
well, anyway, I owed you that before we started. Well, I have so many things to cover, and I know I have kind of a sweet spot I want to hit today, and kind of tap into your psychotherapist background, your clinical experiences. As I mentioned to you on your show, that I kind of feel like I have the life experiences, dealing with, not that I'm the only one that has that, but dealing with the eight years of addiction that Seth went through. And then in my marriage, dealing with that as well and watching that crumble all within a fairly short period of time. Yeah. But what I lack is the clinical evidence and the verbiage and where that's your strength. And you, I'm sure you have life events as well that help complement what you do. Let's go back a little bit and talk about your background. I noticed you had a private practice in DC area, and now you're in sunny Florida. Yes, so tell me how you made the jump from private practice to this lifeology. And I do want you to spend some time on, I love the term lifeology. What a great way to encompass what you're trying to do. But how'd you make that jump, and what was your wow moment?
Ever since I was a child, I had a proclivity that people would just come and talk to me. Like my little friends would come up to me and ask me questions or tell me their struggles. And it's always just a natural inclination for me. But the funny thing was I wanted to be a musician, or I am a musician. But when I went to undergrad, I wanted to be a geneticist. I wanted to cure cancer, and I had all this genetic background. And then from there, I got a really big music scholarship and transitioned into to music. And then from there, I transitioned into psychology and Spanish with a music minor. So all over the place, because we all have interests, and I had quite a few. So with that, I took the easy way out, I suppose. When it came to graduate school, I decided to, instead of going to the new school and to do film and acting, because I did a lot of that when I was younger, I thought, well, let me do something to fall back on. So I decided to go to graduate school to become a psychologist or psychotherapist. Did that. And the older I became, I found that I was pretty good at it. Ironically, though, in my graduate school, except for one of my professors who was like a grandma to me, everyone thought I needed to change my career, my field. I wasn't good at it. I wouldn't be successful. And it was just this whole thing of, James, you're not very serious about this, which maybe I wasn't, but they just didn't think I had the skills for it. So a couple years later, I don't think I've done too bad. But for me, when I was in private practice, I was in for private practice, I think about 12, 13 years before I decided to change. And so for me, it was all about, I enjoyed what I was doing, but I knew there was a calling on my life or something that was greater than where I currently was. And the research states that everybody in their professional field will have 5 iterations or 5 versions of what that looks like. So I thought, okay, well, that would make sense. I'm now in the next version, or going to create the next version of what that is. So for me to speak to people one-on-one or do group counseling or to do couples counseling, that was fine. And I enjoyed that. But at that time, I was feeling restless. And because I had a lot of we all have a lot of talents, but for me, my talents just weren't being expressed the way that I wanted them to. So I thought, well, okay, I'm pretty much changing everything. So got to have a really I got out of a relationship at that time. I was like, it's so expensive to live in the DC area, and I don't really want to live here anymore. And just silly things kept happening as far as telling me it's time to go. So I have a really good friend that I was talking to. He's like, well, James, why don't you come down to Florida? So I came down here and I thought, let me just try it out. So when I came down here, I absolutely loved it. But my goal was I wanted to be location independent and do whatever it is I was going to do wherever I wanted to do it. And so when I was thinking about what are my skills and where would that all intersect into create something? So I was like, well, I actually interview people for a living. If you think about it, psychology and I've been in the field for about 25 years now. So if I'm interviewing that many people, that's really what you're doing when you're talking to someone. So I'm interviewing, I like to be on camera. I talk a lot. I'd like to do those things. So I was looking at the intersect and entertainment, and that's how I created Lifeology. The thing was for me, when I was younger, I always wanted to have my own TV show. So when I started Lifeology, my goal was always to have my TV show. So every day for 6 months, I was on camera and I practiced my craft. And I thought, okay, well, I want to teach life lessons, which is what Lifeology does. So for 6 months, every single day, I would do an episode, a 3 to 4 minute episode. And if you see the first ones, it's pretty bad. The content's good, but it's not inspiring at all. It's not obviously where I'm at today. So, but I did it, and because my goal was to be on camera. So in the future, when I did have my TV show, and we're about to film that right now, that I would be ready. So from there, I practiced and practiced and practiced. And then from there, I went from a podcast to a radio show where I'm at now. And now we'll be filming the TV show very soon. So that's kind of the iteration for me. And so, I miss the private practice. So what I do is I still see some people now and again who want to consult with me. So I do other consultation just for people's life in general. It's not life skills, it's more of a mentoring. And then I do some clinical work, or I still have people call me for clinical consultation with, other colleagues as well to get some background on that. And so that's kind of how it's changed. And so I still do kind of dabble a bit, I suppose, in the psychology world, but I love what I do now. And like I said, get to meet wonderful people like you. And it's just been a really wonderful time for me.
Do you feel like you have enough time to do everything you want?
That's a great question. I look at, in fact, I just did a show yesterday about this as far as the time management. I reverse engineer everything. So if you see my phone, I literally have alarms that go off every random, every 2 minutes, 3 minutes, because it helps me stay on track. So I love downtime like we all do, but I also know when my downtime is going to be planned into my day. So I always reverse engineer everything. So for my day, it's, for tomorrow is how I think about that. So what time do I want to start tomorrow? But in order to be successful for tomorrow, I have to think, what time am I going to go to bed? So that allows me to have the amount of time I need to sleep. And then I reverse engineer and roll everything out. So do I have enough time? I make time. But I also know about self-care, because if I don't have self-care, I'm not as effective as I want to be. So what's the point of doing something if you're not efficient, or the efficacy rate is lower if you can't manage your time? So that's how I always just really keep myself on track. Like I said, it sounds very rigid. That's what works for me.
No. Matter of fact, I didn't know that they call that reverse engineering, because that's how I work too. I've always like when my son and I are going on a golf trip or something, I just start from leaving the hotel, coming home, and I work my way backwards. Exactly. And I didn't know that was called like reverse engineering. I didn't know there was a term for that.
Exactly. Do it. Yeah. It's cool to do that. So for me, I like my alarms. I have those set at each time. Like this morning, I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning. I usually wake up at 5, but 4 o'clock, I was like, okay. But then I would roll out all my time, so every time I was gonna walk my dog, time I need to be back, time I need to go to the gym, et cetera. So that's kind of how my days are. And because we're all busy, but that's the technique that works for me to be able to get everything done. I think you're my second show out of 4 shows today that I'm doing, have a lot more things to do. And I love it. And so I find my energy through my work, and that's what's really important for me.
And you embody the living undeterred, which is kind of a term I came up in my book. I'm fairly certain I got you out a copy of the book, right?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. I didn't remember if I got so many mailing out all the time, but the word undeterred was something, when I played sports and when I was in school, and I was an average student, and I had 3 brothers. So, mom would throw food out and say, here, food's at 5. If you are hungry, come here. I'm not going to reheat it or nothing. So it's like, I had to be undeterred. I had to fight, and coming into the business, I slept 100. I worked 100 hours a week, slept in my car. There was no cell phones. We had whiteout for my typewriter in college. I didn't have the internet. I'm out trying to sell investments, which is a non-tangible. It's an intangible product. So I have to paint these pictures in people's heads of what retirement looked like to my friends who are 20 broke. It was tough. It was really hard. So I learned resiliency. I learned how to be undeterred. But I did have enough credits in college I had a finance major, but to have kind of a psychology minor, I like to call it for lack of a term. I never officially got a psychology minor, but man, at my age now with what I've been through and even building up my practice, I used my psychology minor 100 times more than I ever used my finance degree.
That's amazing. And I find that most people do that because the more understanding you have of one's mind or the motivation for why people do things, I mean, you can understand how to sell. I don't mean that in a minute.
Yeah, right.
You understand how they think.
I studied a lot about people's relationships with money. And I coined this phrase, financial hoarders. And these are people who are rich, older people, but they're miserable. The money became quantity over quality. And the money obsessed them so much that they became rich, old, miserable people. And so this was before my son died, before I had all my chaos in my life. And so I was already interested in behavioral economics and really interested in that whole world. And then all of a sudden these things happen, and I started to follow the addiction and the alcoholism. And I thought, wow, there's a whole lot of overlap there between people with poor relationships with money, i.e. financial hoarders for me, and people who are alcoholics. The things they go through, the steps of addiction, the blaming other people for their problems, the inability to actually let go and enjoy spending their money.
Sure.
And I see alcoholics and people who battle with this. I see my son when I go through and kind of reverse engineer what happened to Seth. I'm going to start using that term now every day. And try to peel back the layers, James, and figure out, why did he think at that time, October 4th, 2016, that heroin in his arm was a decision. I'm not going to say it was good, but was a decision that he didn't have control over to say no. I'm just torturing myself on trying to figure out why. And one of the reasons I wanted to drag you on this show is that you have a deep well of knowledge that you can maybe help the listeners and help me try to understand what he may have been thinking.
When someone is actively in an addiction, they don't think logically. So everything you just said is very logical. Why would he do that? That's a logical question. But
right.
When you're in addiction, when someone's in an active addictive mode, they don't think logical. So even they can see something that's important to them. Let's say their dog needs to be fed or something, and they see it. But when they're about to use or in that mind, they're aware of it, but the empathy level isn't there to accomplish the responsibilities they have to have, or that awareness enough to say, yes, this is my responsibility. Because everything goes back to the flood of dopamine, of serotonin, of whatever it is you're using, that pleasure center is so great that's what allows them to not be responsible for that or not make the healthiest choices, because they're not in the quote right mind. They're in a hypersensitive state of mind when it comes to how they feel. And so it's very sensory. And so when people make those decisions or use whatever it might be, it's because they want to be flooded with that with those senses. That's so great that life, unfortunately, doesn't give that to you, because it can give it to you in small, minute ways. But to have that pleasure center be flooded with so much dopamine and so much serotonin, there's not a word for it, or to my knowledge, there's nothing in the natural state of mind that can give you that amount of dopamine or that hit of dopamine that great for that long period of time. So that's where a lot of people will do that. So that's why people turn to additional substances, is because they get the instantaneous feeling of it, where, people, if we use gratitude, we use meditation, mindfulness, all those types of things can give you a long version of that. But when someone uses, they get the spike of that. And that spike is where they want to be. And then they feel it. And then whatever the drug is, then all of a sudden they come down. And because there's so much of that dopamine that's been like flooded in their brain, when they come down, all of a sudden it goes below the threshold. And that's where people have so much despair, so much loneliness, so much hopelessness, because they're like, oh my gosh, the world is horrible, because their body no longer makes that dopamine, because it has to turn off because it got too much. And so that's why you find the dysregulation of that. So we obviously do the more long-lasting aspect of the healthier version of that, sustains it, where when someone uses a substance, it floods them so much that your body stops making it, they crash. And then that's why they want to use more, or keep using, because they're trying to get that feeling of so much of that dopamine that just hits their brain. But the more they use and it continues, that's why the addiction gets greater and greater, because your body creates a tolerance. Now with heroin, it's different, because a tolerance, it doesn't last. You have to be very careful with that, because unfortunately when people use heroin, your body can lose a tolerance right away and go back down. So anytime someone uses the same amount a few days later, et cetera, then unfortunately there's an opportunity that they could overdose with that. Where the other drugs, go ahead.
Oh no, go ahead. I
was saying the other drugs, where like cocaine or methamphetamines, anything like that, you saw the risk of that, but they're all dangerous. I'll just say that. But the heroin, of course, is the one that can give you the long lasting aspect of it. But the come down is so intense.
And we think that based on the needle marks they found on Seth, that he had just been dabbling with heroin. So he wasn't a heroin addict.
Yeah.
The fentanyl killed him.
Yeah.
That's what killed him, not the heroin. And so, again, peeling back the layers, going all the way back to the fact, and I think I told you this on your show, James, that he was labeled at 15 ADD, attention deficit disorder. And I have ADD as well. I'm fairly certain you do too. I think it helps anybody in any endeavor that they partake in. Yeah. I mean, we're hyper-focused. You and I both are. And so once he got that label kind of stamped on his forehead, I think he looked at it as he was accursed, like a werewolf, that, at certain times his ADD was a problem. Now, my dad's a retired physician. My dad was a University of Iowa practicing physician. He was the team doctor for the Iowa basketball team for 30 years. Yeah, Lute Olson hired my dad back in the 70s. Wow. And so when I was younger, my dad told me ADD was a superpower. And I actually grew up feeling sorry for kids that weren't hyper,
Really?
And yeah. And so it's like, my whole life, I've never looked at my ADD as a impediment. To me, it was something that I had the other kids didn't have. And I am sure, and was going to make sure I took advantage of it. So it helped me work 100 hours a week. It helped me borrow money to stay in business. It helped me, people tell me no and right in my face, and I go to the next one, get another no, just keep going. So Seth didn't look at it that way, James. He viewed it differently, and I tried to present it to him as a positive, but I noticed something you wrote. It's a really good article you wrote in January. I got off your website, called Creating Self-Acceptance. And as I read that, I could see Seth sitting there and playing these things in his head. And I think your article you wrote, it's January 20th, 2021, that was on your website. That really hit me pretty hard about the lack of self-acceptance, the issues he put on himself that he just couldn't get through. And so he started abusing. And so for me, it's like, what can I do? Can I go and help the 38-year-old housewife that has 2 bottles of white wine at night and she's an alcoholic? Probably not. I don't know if that's where I want to spend my life, James, but can I get to the kid that's 14 or 13 and get into what I think I term pre-habituation, get into it before a habit. Yeah. And I got that term from Patrick Moore. He's another gentleman that I would love to have you hook up with someday. Sure. He has a book, it's right here, called Prehab. And it's about risk response patterns. And he did a study at Kennesaw State University with college students about trying to get stage 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 before they get into rehab. So he called it pre-habituation. So you could identify risk response patterns in kids before they become alcoholics. And I read the book and I'm like, this is awesome stuff. This is what I was looking for, because there's 14,000 treatment centers in the United States. It's like, I think we're just I don't know if that's the aim, I'm not sure how much help I can do to help those people, and I kind of want to.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Prevention is always the key when it comes to things, because, prevention is anything, but prevention comes with awareness. When you're aware of something and you can put a name to something, that's where it removes the power from something. So whether it's addiction, whether it's abuse, like substance abuse, that doesn't mean you're addicted.
Yeah. Right.
Dependence, there's different levels of that. So knowing where you are in that, and just having that real that honest talk with yourself. I abuse alcohol. I abuse this. I abuse that. And having that awareness, because many times people allow those situations and those thoughts to blackmail them. We don't realize that we do realize that we don't want people to know what we do in secret. When the camera's off, everything's off. Who am I? And so that's one thing I always ask myself as well. When no one's around, am I still James? Am I still the same person that shows up on camera, on the radio? And, I'm sure there are blind spots that I have. We all have those. But it's so important to ask yourself that question: who am I truly, and do I purport what I really believe? And so when you're aware of those blind spots and say, yes, I am struggling here, or perhaps last night I did something where I'm not proud of it, but instead of shaming yourself, you grow from it. So the question I always have people ask themselves is, what did I learn about myself, or what am I learning about myself right now? Well, I'm learning that I struggled with alcohol last night, as an example, or for example. And so with that, well, then what was I trying to cover? Because it's always a response. We always have self-soothing behaviors. I don't know if we talked about this before, but self-soothing behaviors are behaviors that allow us to soothe ourselves. And they're always based off of our five senses. But what most people don't realize is the five senses are based off of the default sense you use when you were a child. So for you, I can see you look like you're more sense of touch for the way use psychology here, the way you touch your mouth, the way you move your hands, etc. The way you think and the way you process is yours is a sense of touch. So as a child, I would have you go back when you were a child, and this is all science. This is not. But when you go back with science, and you would even probably look at your pictures. What were the things that calmed you? So when you use your five senses, you have your sense of taste, touch, smell. What am I missing there? Sight and hearing, obviously the main ones. So when you look at those, you want to say, well, as a child, which one would I use all the time? Which one really soothed me? And so when we look at that, that's more than likely the default you have as an adult. Anyone has as an adult. The problem is that when we use that and we're not aware that it's really linked with our childhood aspect or child self-soothing, then we don't grow that version up. And so that's when we engage in unhealthy self-soothing behaviors based off of the five senses. And so that's something to say, okay, well, what is that primary sense that I've been using, and now how do I make it in a healthy way? So the sense of touch, as a child can be, your blanket, being hugged. The sense of taste can be your pacifier, or the milk you were given, or your juice box, whatever that might be. Sense of sight can be a TV show or the mobile above your bed. The smell can be the smell of your mother's perfume, or whatever that might be. But there's all different aspects of what that is. And so when you can be aware of that, look where your deficit is as an adult that you're struggling with, more than likely linked with an unhealthy self-soothing behavior that was based off of the childhood template that you used, which was healthy, but as we grew up, we didn't grow that version of their self-soothing behavior up. All that to say, when it comes back to when people who use substances, a lot of that has to do with their inability to self-soothe. And so if they're struggling, this is a general statement. It's obviously to your son, because I never met him. But the general statement would be, when we're struggling and we don't know how to self-soothe, we will turn to something. So sense of if someone drinks, that could be their sense of taste. That's a version of that. The actual action itself, putting the glass down, becomes ritualistic, which is a sense of touch. So there's multiple reasons why people do things, but it's all linked back to a self-soothing behavior or the inability to self-soothe. And so when we struggle with that, but we will use the default sense we had when we were a child, and that's how it rolls out in addictions today.
Do you see a danger in labels, even labels such as alcoholic or addict? Or, in a sense, aren't we all addicts? And quite honestly, I did a class last year with, I think they were freshmen in high school, with my son Roman, talking about all this stuff. And I always start the class off by saying, help me, let's identify some addictions. And all these students are eager to help. So they jump in with alcohol, drugs. And I say, is telling the truth an addiction? Is honesty an addiction? Is good eating an addiction? And so I shot off some positive addictions to try to get them to not think that the word addiction itself isn't, but until I define it, I'm not really telling you anything. Because there are plenty of good addictions as well.
The negative and so you put on things, of course, determines.
And so the labels, I go back to ADD with Seth. That's kind of the beginning of the downfall for him, is when he didn't accept that as a diagnosis, or a label for him, and struggled with that. But let me ask you about coping mechanisms. You threw out a couple, and I use meditation. I meditated before you came on the show to calm me down, to get me focused, because I'm really honored you're on my little tiny show out here in the Midwest. But, and I'm a big believer in Stoicism as well. And I've read Ryan Holiday's summary of Stoicism. You and I never really got into spirituality, but I was just going to throw it out there and see, is spirituality and those type of things something that is a coping mechanism for you that gives you balance in your life, or do you have other things that you use as a tool?
Yeah, spirituality is something very big in my life. I have a very strong faith in God, which is not spirituality. I mean, it is a form of spirituality. So for me, I love it that everybody has. I encourage people to have some form of spirituality. It doesn't matter what mine is what anybody else is, but it's what works for them. So for me, it's my relationship with God. And so I always break things down to one: spirit, mind, and body. So for me, the spirit part is that cheerleader in you, that when you can connect to something greater than yourself, that says, James, you're going to do this. You don't know what's going to go on, but this wasn't a surprise. This was not a surprise to your greater power, your higher power rather. So just relax. It's going to work out. It may not work out the way you want it to work out, but there's a resolution. And so when you look, for me, if I look back at my life, I look at all events like a jigsaw puzzle. When all the jigsaw puzzle pieces come together, that's who I am today. For better, for worse, I like who I am. And so with that, I understand that, okay, if things have worked out before, what's the likelihood they're not going to work out for right now if I'm struggling with something? Often we have these myopic viewpoints we get so caught up in what's happening right now that we forget we've experienced this before. I've experienced fear before. I've experienced heartache before. So what did I do that worked for me? And what did I do that didn't work for me? So let me just roll that out and do the same thing again, or avoid the things that didn't work for me before, because we often try and think we have to reinvent the wheel. And in reinventing the wheel, we lose the options of, I'm going to get through this. And so the confidence rather that we're going to get through this. So for me, I use my spirituality all the time. That's every morning I start my day. The first half hour of my day is always something spiritual. And that's what I do. I always tell people how you start your day is indicative of how your day is going to go. So if I start my day in a mindful spiritual practice, I know that the next thing I'm going to do is going to dovetail off of that, or it's going to create that energy that I can now bring that same calmness or sense of whatever into the next activity. And I keep doing that. So then I also check in with myself all the time. I always have an internal dialogue going, because it allows me to censor, not in an unhealthy way, but asking myself, what am I learning about myself right now? Or what's my motivation for this right now? Why am I on this show right now? Why am I talking about this right now? That allows me to constantly have that narrative that keeps me in check to say, you don't have to talk just to talk. Everybody can talk just to talk.
Right.
But what are you saying? Is it encouraging? Is it helpful? Is it helping you? Myself. And that's something that's so important, because our internal self-talk is the most important thing that's going to help us through. So for me, I use my spirituality. I use my internal self-talk. I use meditation, guided imagery. I do a lot of things. I play the piano, so I play the piano a lot, and that's what really helps me kind of process things. We talked before when you were on my show the first time. We had to redo it because I had to. Yeah. We talked about EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and what that's kind of cool. Well, it's very cool, because what it does for anyone who has any type of trauma or any type of something that creates a visceral response, it allows them to process it in a way that their body doesn't have that feeling. And then that's when you use the cognitive therapy to work through the emotions of it. But sometimes we link together the experience of how our body just can tremble and get overwhelmed, our heart rate increases, et cetera. But that we link that with our thoughts. So EMDR, what that does is it helps reduce the response of your body, so then you can actually have a conversation about it without having all the internal the stuff that's the underbelly of the trauma affecting you. So the whole point of me saying that with EMDR is when I play the piano, what I'm basically doing is I'm using both sides of my brain. So even when you're typing as well, if someone's driving, the slight movement in their hand of how they're moving, the steering wheel, or washing dishes, those types of things, when you use both sides of your brain, in other words, both hemispheres, so your brain's cut in half, split on left and right, that allows you to access both sides. So in a very basic way, your left side is a logical side and your right side is a creative side. More to it, but essentially you get the point. So to allow both sides to work together allows you to access your brain in a different way. So when you move your hands or allow that to happen and allow your mind just to kind of roam free, then you'll notice that all of a sudden you're thinking about one thing, and then like 5 minutes later, you're like, why am I thinking about it when I was a 5-year-old boy? What happens? So what happens is your body is zipping together all of those connections of how you process something, or when you process something. So I said this in a very, very basic way. People who do EMDR, it's a much more There's a lot more to it than that, but this is a very, very elementary way that I'm explaining this. But that's one way that I do it. So I recommend people check out EMDR. Experience trauma or anything like that. But from a very practical standpoint, just allow yourself to just think, just no censoring when you're doing something that allows you to use both hands at the same time, or both sides of your brain at the same time. So when people run, it was very meditative for people. When people work out, it can be very, very meditative. So but when it comes to the repetitive pattern, that's where your mind can be free and to just really explore that. So I always recommend, if someone's dealing with trauma, to talk to someone about that. But on a daily basis, if you want to practice this, just allow your mind to be free as you're doing something that's more repetitive in behavior. And you'll see that you'll start to feel better, because it removes the visceral response that you have when you're struggling with something.
Yeah, it reminds me of something I thought I heard you either say or write, where you said 66 days it takes something to become a habit. And so when I started meditation about a year after Seth died, I immediately thought, well, nothing's happening. I can do this when I sleep. Yeah. And then I was trying to control my thoughts, and then I was trying not to control my thoughts, which is actually trying to control your thoughts. And finally, I use a guided meditation. I use Sam Harris. That's who I do mine with. And it's nice because it allows me to really kind of separate your mind and body, and be aware that thoughts and experiences are just that. They're just thoughts and experience. They literally don't exist. And if you can just observe them to come in and go, when you're in the store and somebody cuts in front of you, you just say, hey, this is going to come and go. Like you just said, this soon shall pass. So for me, meditation's been great. But the other thing I caught on a podcast was this embracing impermanence from a standpoint that we say, good times don't last forever. And you just said this, James, in a way, nor do the bad. And I think for people going through trauma, the idea of impermanence means that this is going to end too. My feelings of the pain I had when I got the call at 6:30 in the morning that they found my son dead. Now, this is before I even knew this stuff, because I'm in a whole different realm of learning and knowledge now than I was before he died. But now I'm like, these opportunities are presented to me as learning experiences. Not as punishment, not as vindication, but as ways for me to say, okay, death came into my life on a platter, and I need to embrace this opportunity, knowing that now I know in hindsight that Seth's life was limited. Yeah. Well, so is mine. So is my other two boys. So is my parents. And so that idea of death being an efficient teacher, it's helped me deal with Seth's death. And I'm not saying I don't have extremely depressive moments. I do. I mean, horrendous. Yeah. I considered suicide for a year after he died. But I didn't. And I don't know why. But now I've got really good foundation built up that now when I have opportunities presented to me, like if I had a death happen today, I would know how to handle it. I would know how to handle it. So, where am I going with this? I don't know, but I think I'm just on this learning curve, and I have so much to learn. Yeah. And in hearing how you present narratives to people to help them deal with some of the trauma and some of the anxiety of just being human, sure. I think I'd like to hear a little bit about your book. I know you wrote about it. Yeah, I jumped. That's my ADD. I wanted to get to your book, and I want to get to your TV show. Sure. So that's my segue into your book and TV show. Okay.
Well, let me say this. So thank you for sharing that with me. I love hearing your story, and I love hearing about Seth. I mean, what a wonderful young man. When it comes to life, you're really, Jeff, you're really good at reframing. So I hear you when you told your kids, okay, you have an opportunity to, we can go on the same path he did, or we can go on a journey together and move forward with this. Life always gives us opportunities. So when you think of a diamond has so many facets. And our opportunity is to look at that diamond and say, well, which facet of this do I want to look at? And if I constantly look at the same facet of a diamond, well, I'm going to get the same result, because that's literally all I see. So in any situation, if you don't like how you feel, or it's overwhelming, then you ask yourself, well, how would James look at this? Or how would Jeff look at this? And so when you use someone else's potential perspective of how they would look at it, that kind of tilts your mind a bit to shift that diamond. So you're like, oh, okay, well, that might be true. Because the whole point in changing one's opinion or one's feelings is to create doubt that maybe what I'm thinking isn't 100% true.
Right.
And it's funny in the English language, the word belief, let me back up, the antithesis or the antonym for the word belief is truth. In other words, the opposite. So we often think that I believe it's true. No, it's not. According to the dictionary, the opposite word for true is belief. So with that awareness right there, and all of a sudden it says, "Oh, I didn't know that." So if I'm so wedded to this, so my thoughts create my emotions create my response. If I don't like the response or how I'm feeling, that means I need to change how I think about it. And it's not something that happens like, "Oh, I'm 100% different." But what it does is it gives you the ability to say, if it's not 100% true, then what's that 1% that could be true? And so it allows a person to look at it in a different way. Because if we get stuck in a label or we get stuck in a trauma, and once again, there's a time and place to grieve, and I'm all for appropriate grief. That's wonderful. And then beyond that, then what do you do? Because beyond that, life still goes on. And it's very, I know that can sound really harsh, but life is like a current in a river. It's going to move whether we want to move or not. So what do? Do you swim down the river as fast as you go? Do you try and paddle backwards? And so you get to be that version of that swimmer in the current of life. And what do you do with it? So what I help people do is just kind of alter their perception about something to say, well, if that's not true, what could be true? So I help people create an opportunity to search for truth that makes sense for them, that's healthy for them. And so that's kind of segueing into my book. That's what my book is about as well. I can't say too much. I mean, I can say about it, but it boils down to right now, the book has 32 chapters. And what it basically does is it gives you kind of like the articles you read on my website. What it does is you can look at anything you're struggling with. You don't have to read it like linear, like a normal book. If you're struggling with anxiety, you're struggling with self-esteem, you're struggling with just how do you deal with your family, all those things, it breaks it down so you can look at all the different aspects of one's life and say, okay, I don't know what to do, but I know there's a chapter in this book or in James's book that I can read that'll give me a good foundation. And then from there I can reset and I can go. Because my job isn't to tell you how to live your life. My job is to help you. The job I've given myself is to help a person create a foundation, and then they create their life based off of the foundation, because we are all successful as we want to be. So we're all self-made when it comes to life. And who. So
your book is kind of something that somebody doesn't have to read it in chronological order. Correct. They can pick and choose. Are you going to do an audiobook?
More than likely I will. I'm talking, the book isn't published yet. So I'm talking with, in fact, a literary agent today about something. So with that's great. But so I'll probably have an audiobook with it. Lots of things that are connected with it. Just like you, I think strategically. So I have a lot of strategic things that go along with it. I have a book series. I have children's books that I'm writing as well. So there's a lot going on that I'm excited about. But with the book coming out, it will basically give someone the hope that there's always an answer, and gives them a direction to say, slow down, take a look at this. What if things were a little bit different? And if that's the case, then how would you react differently? How would you show up differently? And that just gives people, once again, the opportunity to say, we always have a choice. And in that choice, we determine how we're going to feel and what we're going to do based off of how we look at something, our perception.
Right. And that's exactly why my nonprofit's called the Choices Network, is I wanted it to be focusing on choices, and not telling kids what not to do. I mean, look how well that helped when we were kids. But to teach them, empower them how to think, here's the situation. I'm not there. A kid's offering you a vape at a football game. How are you going to make that decision to make the correct one for you? Not for mom and dad, but the correct one for you. So you also have a TV show coming out, and I'd like to have you talk a little bit about that. I know that was a bucket list for you when you were a young person, and it looks like it's coming to fruition. So tell me a little bit about it.
Well, it's kind of like the radio show. So it's called Lifeology with James Miller. It's very, very simple. It's where Lifeology Radio is so my
that's unique.
I know, right? Who's been that? Very creative. So Lifeology Radio is obviously the radio show, but under my umbrella with the TV show, what that's going to focus on is it's a little bit different. The direction this one I guess kind of reviews is, the tagline is we all have life experiences, and we may seem different, but our emotions are still the same. So what I will do is I'll take specific emotional constructs. In other words, grief, loneliness, isolation, even concepts like entrepreneurship or whatever it might be. So I have specific constructs or ideas that I use, and then I have someone who is different than what society would say was, quote, successful. Because I want people to really realize that we all have our own versions, our own stereotypes of what is what. So my show breaks down stereotypes and help people recognize that their neighbor whom they thought was different is not so different after all. Because we all are connected on an emotional standpoint. We all know what grief feels like. We all know what love feels like, rage, joy, bitterness, whatever it might be. We all know what that feels like. So my show really focuses on the emotional aspect of what someone experienced during something. And then through that, I, just like in my normal radio show, I will ask questions to really help the listeners understand what that's like. And then at the end, I will also have discussion points and discussion topics that I want families to talk about. Like, what were some of those questions? What did you learn from this? Who do you know that may be different, that may not be as different? So I really wanted to create a dialogue for people after they watch the show. So therefore, we can break down their stereotypes, because as we know, life can be very divisive and society can be very divisive, but we're really all the same. It's just life is just different the way it rolls out. But at the end of the day, we're all human beings who love and who hate and who feel all these things. So my show will really help people see that we are literally all the same.
When's your show coming out?
That's a great question. We are literally at the time of this. We're supposed to be lined up for summer lineup for this year, for 2021. Because of COVID, we were supposed to actually start filming last November. It's not November right now. So I get to learn patience, and I don't like patience, but that's the lesson I've learned since the time of this filming here in this show. So like I said, by June 15th, we're supposed to start filming. And if that doesn't happen, then of course we'll have to go for fall. But blessings and burdens to happen. Everything has been taken care of. It's just we need more funding that has to be revetted again. And the revetting resets the clock. So you get a blessing and a burden. So I'm very happy with all the investors and all the people who are advertising and a part of this brand. It's been such a blessing. So I'm really looking forward to that. So definitely check out, your local listings for when my show comes out. Lifeology with James Miller. Like I said, very creative name.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super excited to get the book and to watch the show. I just wrapped up my audiobook for this one's for you. And I hired a studio, went to a professional studio, and I had not read my book since it was published. And I tell you, it was tough. I mean, I told the guy that was editing for me, I said, there's going to be times I'm going to have to just shut this down and leave. And boy, it just kind of, it was very beneficial to read it again, but because I read it 200 times as I was writing it. But I made an effort. I told myself, if I'm going to do an audiobook, it's going to be my voice. Yeah. There's no way I can tell a story. There's no way I can tell a story from the perspective I want it to be, from the lens, from the frame that you talked about, with hiring somebody to come in and do it. How do you fake that love for your son, or the anger of the addiction challenge I had? And even the personal vulnerability. I talk about my compulsive gambling in my 30s. I mean, here I am, a financial advisor, and I'm a compulsive gambler. Those are things you're not put on your resume. And also I was an alcoholic, but I built up a multi-million-dollar investment firm. So I'm like, that was all great until 50. Then boom, the rug's taken out from underneath me. And all these skills I learned to build up my practice, now I had to actually implement them in real life, Yeah. So, so what's next? What's next for you? I mean, you got I still am amazed on how you do what you do.
I appreciate that. I'll smoke and mirrors. No, I'm kidding. As far as what's next for me, it's just, as a lot of people I'm strategic in my planning. And so for me, I've already thought out the third season of what the TV show looks like. And then from there, the expansion of that when it comes to a lot of other services I'm providing. And I'm doing a lot of guest spots on TV and radio shows coming up. I think I'll be on CBS Radio in a couple weeks and a few other pretty big shows. It doesn't matter the size, just shows. Right. So for me, that's a wonderful thing. I'd love to give back. I'm always honored to be on any show. So I'm super, super honored that you allowed me to be on your show today. But everything overall, I mean, it's just how my brand gets bigger and bigger. Talking to a lot of different syndication networks. I want to syndicate the radio version, looking at some television networks who wants to do the interviews that I've been doing for the radio version and roll that out for different season for the radio version of the video version, if that makes sense. So it won't be TV show, but like your video, the one when you were on my show, which you did a fantastic job, by the way. That one will go on those networks as well. So we're kind of in talks with that. So lots of great things happening. I have a wonderful manager, Stephen O'Connor with Brushwood Media. In fact, do you remember Archie Bunker?
Yeah, of course I do. Yeah.
Carol O'Connor, his nephew, is my manager, so Stephen O'Connor.
Okay.
Fantastic. So so we all have a good time working together. He is just like me, has a really strategic mind too. So it's great to work with him.
Well, I think you and I both are kind of in a time frame where if you have a passionate cause, I've got this term I like to say, and I say purpose becomes passion when it gets personal. Mm-hmm. And on October 4th, 2016, it got real personal for me. Yeah. And all of a sudden my purpose became a passion. And so I'm presenting that to people, find your why and you'll find your way, and I'm secular. I'm agnostic. So that's one thing that's very interesting about this is my close circle of friends, my deepest, closest friends are all believers and I'm spiritual. I'm just agnostic. Yeah. So I think the awesomeness of all this is it doesn't matter what you believe. It's how you behave.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, that's all that matters.
And what do you internalize and what were the lessons you learned? Exactly.
Yep. And so, if we can help each other, help other people, and you believe in whatever you want to believe, as long as you are a good, honest, hardworking, fair person, behavior trumps belief quite often. And unfortunately, that's not what happens.
Sure. Yeah. Exactly. It's funny. My show, I always ask myself, okay, the people that are on my show, I think of people like I have great friends who are atheists, great friends who are agnostic. For me, it's I love everybody.
Yeah, I do too.
If you're mean to me, then yeah. But with that, I always think, when I have someone on my show, I ask myself, well, is this an opportunity for everyone, wherever you are, to learn? And is the message audible where it makes sense, where people would be interested? And so my goal is to create a narrative in the interview process so that everybody can hear something and take away from something, because my belief system is mine and theirs is theirs. And how can where's that intersect where we all can meet together to learn and grow as a community, as listeners, to be able to change the world. So that's really how I do it. So I think of everyone in all different aspects. I think of the most educated person I know and the person who's least educated, which doesn't mean intelligence, it just means education. And then I look at different belief systems, different ethnicities. And so for me, I'm like, okay, this is going to be a good show. So that's how I build my show, is to make sure that everyone listening, it'll affect a greater reach, as opposed to being too niched where it only appeal to a certain number of people. So that's kind of the secret sauce to my show, is how do you make your message audible that everybody wants to continue to listen to it. And it makes sense, not pushes the envelope, but pushes one's belief system to say, just like I said before, with that diamond. Oh, it's interesting. I didn't know that. I want to learn more about that. And then the credits roll and my work is done.
Well, it got me thinking. I know we got a few minutes. I want to have you out of here. I know you got a wired day. So 2 or 3 minutes, we'll wrap this up. But, the Living Undeterred project is so similar to what Lifeology is doing, because I go back to my guests. I've had a lady who was raped, was sexually molested, became a prostitute, was a cocaine addict, was a felon. She went back to college, and now she owns her own aerospace engineering company. Oh my God. I met another girl that was sexually molested by her grandfather, and now she's one of the largest social media influencers out there talking about these things. Mm-hmm. I've met people that have been, I've met a dad named Steve Grant who lost his only 2 sons to heroin overdose. I lost one of my 3. He lost his only 2 boys. Yeah. So, you're right. I didn't want to paint myself in a corner and just talk about, the opioid crisis. And then all I did every week was just bring on people that just talked about that, because I feel compelled that there's more to this story. There's such a mental health umbrella over all this that even in what you're doing has so many aspects of mental health. And so, how do people reach you? What's the easiest way to reach you?
Well, once again, thank you so much for allowing me to be a guest on your show today. Just simply go to jamesmillerlifeology.com and you can reach out with me there. I'm pretty active on Instagram, which is James Miller Lifeology. On Twitter, it's James M Lifeology. And I don't really use Facebook, but James Miller Lifeology. It's pretty standard. That's where everybody can reach me there.
Well, I think what's awesome is you allow people like me to come on your show as kind of as a small voice out here in the Midwest. And I've never been on a platform as big as yours. And the fact that you actually personally emailed me and took the time to reschedule, we redid your show, because you weren't satisfied with the quality of the show. I would have been fine probably, James, but you weren't. And you took so much attention to this small story out here that I'm trying to pay that forward. And now I'm trying to find people that maybe don't have those compelling stories I have, but their voice needs to be heard. So, I'm grateful that I met you, and you are an inspiration to me. And I'm trying to create what you're doing out here in the Midwest, and hopefully together you and I can help a lot of people.
Yeah, well, I'm confident you're doing that. And one thing is well, and first I'll thank you. That's very, very kind of you. I truly appreciate that. The way I look at things is, regardless of one's platform, we all have a life lesson to learn, a life lesson to teach. And so I love, like I said, meeting everybody wherever they are in their life, regardless of what platforms they have. If I can give back in any way, that's what I love to do. So I'm always open. And I appreciate you saying that about the email. That's something I do. I get pitched a lot of, a couple hundred pitches a day. So I try, and the ones that are relevant, I try and go back. I can't get everybody, but the ones that I'm interested in, I will go back and I will personally email them myself and talk with them about their story, et cetera, and see if it would be a good fit. So, but I appreciate that. And I know you're doing a fantastic job. I mean, you have such a great show. I've actually been listening to it. So you've done a fantastic job. And I know that regardless of, so just be careful with that label of saying a small person, because we don't do small ways. You got to be mindful of that. So you're not a small person. You have a fantastic show, and you're going to change the world like you've been doing already. So
I appreciate being on your journey, and I'm welcoming you to my journey. So have a great rest of your day, and thanks for being on the Living Undeterred podcast. And I have no doubt our paths will cross.
They certainly will. Thanks again.